Welcome back to another edition of the Disney Dish Podcast. It is me, Jim Hill, and this is our show for the week of Schmurz Day, August 26, 2024. On the show today, we talk about the two Disney villains that made their debut at the Oogie Boogie Bash just last night at California Adventure. We also answer some listener mail, and then in our main segment, we discuss the changes that were just made to Peter Pan Flight at Florida's Magic Kingdom, with the hope that this ride will then be seen as a bit more respectful of Native America's culture and traditions. Just so you know, folks, this will be a solo edition of Disney Dish this week. Last I heard, my co-host, Len Testa, is somewhere out in the Gulf of Mexico. On a boat, one would hope. But then again, Mr. Testa has repeatedly told me about his long-held secret desire to just chuck it all, give up the apartment of New York and the home in Celebration, and then become an anonymous roustabout on some offshore oil rig. Mind you, whenever I bring up the 12-hour-long shifts and the back-breaking labor that comes with a career change like that, Len, without even breaking a sweat, then tells me about his other dream, which is to become a mattress tester at Sleep Number, to which I say, get in line behind me, pal. Anyway, Mr. Testa, barring any unfortunate offshore incidents that perhaps will involve British Petroleum, will be back on the job next week. But until then, folks, well, you're stuck with me. And before we get started here, I just wanted to thank everyone who subscribes to this show over on patreon.com/Jim Hill Media. These include David Zarzinski, Chris Gardner, Robert Gormley, Gina Howard, and Majarikara, who I'm pretty sure I saw coming out of Tokyo Harbor in a kaiju movie. Anyway, just in case you're wondering, these nice folks, should the Imagineers go forward with their rumored plan to level the Muppet Vision 3D Theater at Disney's Hollywood Studios to then make room for that Monsters, Inc. themed coaster that Josh D'Amaro announced earlier this month at the D23 Expo. Anyway, these nice folks, should those plans actually go forward, are now planning on climbing up into that cargo net you see hanging down in the pre-show space inside of the Muppet Vision Theater, and then threatening to not come down till WDI rethinks this plan. There's also some talk of a hunger strike, as I understand it, but given that this cargo net is reportedly full of many different flavors of Jell-O, I doubt that David, Chris, Robert, Gina, and Majarika are going to starve anytime soon. Speaking of which, how many of you already knew that this sight gag in the Muppet Vision 3D pre-show is supposed to be a tribute to everyone's favorite Mouseketeer, the late, great Annette Funicello? Because that thing that's hanging down from the ceiling is a net full of Jell-O. A net full of Jell-O. Get it? Okay. Which brings us to the news portion of today's Disney Dish. And as always, the news is sponsored by TouringPlans.com. Touring Plans can help you save time and money at theme parks like Walt Disney World. So please check them out at TouringPlans.com. Which, okay, we want to double back on that Muppet Vision Monsters, Inc. related story for a moment. Prior to heading off on his well-deserved summer vacation, Mr. Testa revealed to me that this past Friday, August 23rd, was supposed to be the day that Disney would then clarify where the Doors coaster was supposed to be built at Disney's Hollywood studio. Well, that day came and went without an official announcement. Now, where this gets interesting is a few days prior to that, on Friday, August 16th, a longtime Walt Disney World employee who works in that backstage building that previously housed Feature Animation Florida shared this info on social media, and I quote, "We were recently informed that we would be leaving our offices at Hollywood Studios. Is this related to some of the D23 announcements? I honestly don't know." Okay, I know. That's not a lot of info to go on. Then again, People online were losing their minds late last week when they noticed that a building facade right across from Stage 1 Company Store, that's the post-show retail space for Muppet Vision 3D, the structure just beyond the exit of that theater, the one whose entrance is flanked by those two largest statues of Kermit wearing tuxedos. You know the place, right? Anyway, people saw that this building facade, again, right across the way from Stage 1 Company Store, was getting its fabric wrap removed, and immediately hopped online to pull a Chicken Little. They were screaming about how the closure of Muppet Vision 3D was now just minutes away and how the bulldozers were already backstage, which is when I say, guys, calm down. Truth of the matter is, there's no official decision yet in regards to where the Monsters, Inc. coaster for Disney's Hollywood Studios is supposed to go. In fact, from what I was told just last week, this project isn't even officially funded yet. Now, I realize a lot of people who work on the internet these days make their money off of articles and podcasts with clickbaity headlines. So, like it or not, you're going to see a lot of those stories in the coming weeks where people try to make the Muppet Vision Monsters, Inc. situation seem as dramatic and as sensational as possible. Truth be told, this whole thing is still very, very, very much in flux at the moment. So, just saying, maybe dial back the hysteria a wee bit and I don't know, maybe wait to see what happens. Now, mind you, of course, sometimes waiting is a bad thing. Case in point, if you waited to get tickets to this year's edition of the Oogie Boogie Bash, that after-hours Halloween-themed hard ticket event, which is held on select nights at Disney California Adventure from August to October, it's now too late. Tickets sold out for this year's Oogie Boogie Bash just 11 days after the Disneyland Resort first put them on sale. So all 27 dates gone clean. Which, if I had known in advance that Dr. Heinz Doofenshmirtz from Phineas and Ferb and Hades from Disney's Hercules were going to be added to this year's treat trail, I would have definitely sprung for a ticket to this after-hours seasonal event. By the way, tickets started at $134 a person. Those were for the dates in late August, and prices crept up in September and October to the point where the last three dates, October 27th, the 29th, and the 31st, $189 a person, $55 more. Now, there's been some from the press preview, which I want to say was on this past Friday night, the 23rd. I have to say, Doofenshmirtz, interesting makeup. Hades is very impressive. And what I especially love about this part of the treat trail is that this character actually does visually what Hades did in the original 1997 Ron Clements John Musker movie, which is he could go from a cool blue flame to raging red hot when provoked. And by the way, folks, we should expect to see much more of this character in the not-so-distant future, because Disney is definitely getting back in the Hercules business. I know on the show previously we've talked about the stage version of Hercules that opened back in March in Hamburg. By the way, tickets for that production are currently on sale through May 4th of 2025, and then next summer, a similar production of Disney's stage version of Hercules, which, just like the one in Hamburg, will be directed and choreographed by Casey Nicholaw. He's the Tony Award winner who also directed Disney's stage version of Aladdin. That production of the show will be opening at the Theatre Royal Drury Lane in London's West End in the summer of 2025, with the long-term goal being that Disney on Broadway very much wants to bring this very same show to New York sometime in 2026 or 2027. Interesting little bend on this story. Disney Theatrical would also really like it if they could get Roger Bart, who's now on Broadway playing Doc Brown in Back to the Future the musical, to reprise his role as Hades. Now, back when Disney effectively did a pilot production of the stage version of Hercules, this was in the summer of 2019. It was produced by the Public Theater at the Delacorte Theater, which is located out of doors in Central Park. I want to say they did a total of 5 performances there, but during that version of the show, Roger was on stage playing Hades. Now, Roger is an interesting choice to play Hades because in the original animated version of Disney's Hercules, the one that was released at theaters in 1997, Roger was young Hercules' singing voice. I mean, it's Bart that you hear whenever you hear Hercules warble, "Go the distance." And what's kind of funny is that Roger likes to joke, at least in regard to his work related to Disney's Hercules, that his career has literally gone to hell over the past 20 years. Now, we're talking about periods of time here, and want to point out that relatively short period of time, we're just 3 months out from when Moana 2, the eagerly anticipated sequel to Disney's holiday 2016 release, finally arrives in theaters on November 27th of this year. Speaking of which, Brendan wrote in this past week to ask, "Hey, Len and Jim, any update on the Blue Sky Moana ride at Animal Kingdom? Was surprised that it didn't get announced at D23. And Brendan, thank you very much for reaching out. And I can understand your confusion. Back at the D23 Expo that was held in 2019, there was a concept art shared that showed a Moana-themed boat ride being built where Dinorama, that roadside attraction portion of Dinoland, U.S.A., is located. Likewise, over where Dinosaur the Ride still operates, the Imagineers revealed that they were considering building a Zootopia attraction, one where guests would ride along with Judy Hopps and Nick Wilde as they work their beat for the Zootopia Police Department. Those plans, however, were changed in 2020, largely because the Imagineers were looking to tell more of a unified story on this side of Disney's Animal Kingdom, which is why the previously announced Moana and Zootopia ideas, which were being considered for this part of the park, and also just want to stress here, they were presented at the expo as Blue Sky projects, ideas that Imagineering was just considering rather than things that were already locked in, ready to start construction. Anyway, Moana and Zootopia were swapped out for Encanto and Indiana Jones inspired attractions, which were then announced. Well, okay. So they were supposed to be announced at the D23 Expo that was going to be held in 2021. But due to the pandemic, that 3-day event got pushed back to 2022. Anyway, at the D23 Expo in 2022, that's when we learned about the new Encanto and Indiana Jones themed rides, which were being considered for Disney's Animal Kingdom. The idea here was that they effectively shared a spot on the map, that they were supposed to be located in a part of the park that would now be reimagined as the tropical Americas. Now, again, want to stress here that Josh D'Amaro, when he initially talked about these proposed additions to Disney's Animal Kingdom, that the Encanto ride and the Indiana Jones themed inspired redo of dinosaurs was Blue Sky, as in maybe these will happen, maybe they won't. It was only with this month's D23 Expo out in Anaheim that we officially learned that these things are supposedly shovel-ready. The construction is going to start very soon. Now, mind you, sometimes Imagineering doesn't give Disney theme park fans any advance notice that changes of size are coming to their favorite shows and attractions. Case in point, when Peter Pan Flight shut down at Florida's Magic Kingdom just 6 weeks ago, there was nothing about this closure of that dark ride that suggested that it was anything more than regularly scheduled maintenance. But then, when Peter Pan Flight reopened Friday last, August 16th, the Indian encampment scene in this Fantasyland favorite now had a whole new look, which we'll discuss in the feature portion of today's show in a few moments. But first, this. And we're back. But before we get started about talking about what just happened to the Magic Kingdom's version of Peter Pan Flight, I have a question to ask you. When's the last time you watched Disney's Peter Pan? I went over to Disney Plus the other day to check out this hand-drawn animated film from 1953, and before the titles rolled, a card came up with the following message. This program includes negative depictions and or mistreatment of people or cultures. These stereotypes were wrong then and are wrong now. Rather than remove this content, we want to acknowledge its harmful impact, learn from it, and spark conversation to create a more inclusive future together. Disney is committed to creating stories with inspirational and aspirational themes that reflect the rich diversity of the human experience around the globe. To learn more about how stories have impacted society, visit www.disney.com/stories. Now, what's kind of funny about this is when you get to the Peter Pan landing page on Disney Plus, what you see is that this animated feature is rated G. But the subscription streaming service also lets parents know that this animated feature, and I'm quoting here, contains tobacco depictions, which means over the course of the 77-minute-long movie, you'll see Captain Hook smoking a cigarette and Peter Pan puffing on a peace pipe. Which isn't why Disney Plus put that "it was wrong then, it was wrong, and it is wrong now" title card in front of Peter Pan. The reason that this subscription streaming service is warning potential viewers about stereotypes and negative depictions can be found, and in this now 71-minute-long movie, again, it's not because several characters smoke, but rather it's the entire scene set at the Indian encampment on Neverland Island. Now, I want to start things off here by stressing that the problematic depiction of Native Americans in Disney's Peter Pan can be traced back to its source material, which is J.M. Barrie's play from 1904, Peter Pan, the Boy Who Wouldn't Grow Up, and the novel that Barrie eventually wrote, which was based on that play. Peter Pan in One Day, which was published in 1911, some 7 years after the play version of Peter Pan was first performed. And it's important to understand that J.M. Barrie wasn't looking to craft a historically accurate document here. That this Scottish playwright was crafting an elaborate fantasy for the stage. A fairy play is what J.M. famously called Peter Pan, which is why he populated Neverland with mermaids and pixies and pirates and what people back 120 years ago called red men or savages, which, like it or not, is how Native Americans were depicted in pop culture back then, as primitive, warlike savages who spoke in single-word phrases like how and ugh. And Walt Disney, when he was adapting Peter Pan to the screen, stuck closely to this story's source material. In this feature-length animated film, he depicted Tiger Lily, the proud, beautiful princess of the Pickaninny tribe. And just quick side notes here, J.M. Barrie chose a particularly unfortunate name for the Native Americans he wrote about in Peter Pan. By using the Pickaninny moniker, J.M. managed to insult not only the indigenous people of North America, but African Americans as well, which isn't really the sort of twofer you should be shooting for. All right. Anyway, Tiger Lily in the original play and the book, is captured by Captain Hook and left to die on Marooner's Rock at Skull Island. Peter rescues Tiger Lily, and as a direct result, the Pickaninny tribe has this great celebration and then forges an alliance with Peter and the Lost Boys against Captain Hook and the pirates. We also learn in the process that Tiger Lily has feelings for Peter, which then ticks off Wendy. It's this particular scene in Disney's 1953 version of Peter Pan, the celebration back at the Indian encampment on Neverland Island, where the company's subscription streaming service, that's why it saw fit to issue this title card, warning of negative depictions and stereotypes. Because this is where we get to hear Sammy Cahn and Sammy Fain's comic number, What Made the Red Man Red, which is sung by Candy Candido and the Mellow Men. Okay, now, have to stress here that the 1950s and the 1940s, for that matter, were a different time in America. Back then, it was perfectly acceptable, whether it was a musical on Broadway or a major motion picture coming out of Hollywood, to use Native American culture and traditions as the stepping off point for a cheap laugh. Case in point, Annie Get Your Gun, a smash hit musical from 1945. It had a big comic number called I'm an Indian Too, which included lines to the effect of, just like battle axe, hatchet face, eagle nose, like those Indians, I'm an Indian too. Ugh. And I want to stress here, by the way, that this song was written by Irving Berlin, the same guy who wrote God Bless America. Likewise, the stage version of Peter Pan, which, by the way, arrived on Broadway in October of 1954, just 20 months after Disney's animated version of Peter Pan first arrived at movie theaters in February of 1953. That show featured a number, I kid you not, called Ugga-Wugg, which was supposed to parody the way that Native Americans reportedly talked. And again, side note, Ugga-Wugg was written by Broadway veterans Jewel Stein, Betty Comden, and Adolph Green, a trio of musical comedy masters who, to be blunt here, should have really known better. But again, it was the 1940s and the 1950s, a different time in entertainment. And if you watch Bob Hope's 1948 comedy, The Paleface, or its sequel, 1952, Son of Paleface, or for that matter, Martin and Lewis's 1956 comedy, Pardners, you'll see that it was perfectly acceptable back then, especially in a Western film set in the West, to make fun of Native Americans by having movie versions of America's indigenous people say how and ugh on screen. Which brings us back to What Made the Red Man Red, the song that Sammy Cahn and Sammy Fain wrote for Disney's Peter Pan. Which again, want to stress here, was supposed to be a comic song, but today, when you hear lyrics like, all right, here's a verse from this song, which asks the question, when did the red man first say ugh? And the gag that Cahn and Fain came up with is, in the Injun book it says, when the first brave married squaw, he let out heap big ugh when he saw his mother-in-law. Which, again, is a twofer. The lyric manages to insult Native Americans and women. Anyway, Peter Pan, Disney's animated movie, opens again in theaters in February 1953, and the Peter Pan Flight, the dark ride, found in the Fantasyland section of Walt's first family fun park, opens with the rest of Disneyland Park back in July of 1955, and for a time there, things are fine. Nobody complains or comments, but then came the late 1960s and the early 1970s, which is when we had Wounded Knee and the occupation of Alcatraz Island, which is a time when America's first peoples rose up and said, we're no longer going to be the butt of your lazy jokes. We're not going to tolerate you turning our proud traditions into fodder for cheap gags. We're proud people with a rich history and culture, so ixnay on the Hollywood promotion of flat-out untrue stereotypes when it comes to Native Americans. Now, what was unfortunate about the timing of all this is literally in the middle of this cultural moment, Walt Disney World opens up down in Florida on October 1st, 1971, and what can guests see when they climb aboard a flying pirate ship and then take off for Neverland as they experience the Magic Kingdom's version of Peter Pan flight? They can look down as their ride vehicle passes over Neverland Island and see a recreation of the Indian encampment from that 1953 film, which has Tiger Lily and her dad, the Indian chief, seated in front of this set of teepees with a bunch of Indian braves, and the chief and his braves look just like those characters did in Disney's 1953 film. So they've got big, flat noses and fire engine red skin. Again, you know how Native Americans were stereotypically depicted back in the 1950s. And Disney then doubles down when it redoes Fantasyland at Disneyland in the early 1980s. Their redo of that theme park's Peter Pan flight, which reopens in May of 83, along with much of that theme park's new Fantasyland, really leans into the look of Disney's 1953 film. It includes Tiger Lily being marooned at Skull Rock and her big-nosed dad, the Indian chief and his red-skinned braves sitting around that campfire. Tokyo Disneyland's version of Peter Pan flight, which opened a month earlier in April of 83, did the exact same thing, really leaning into the stereotypical depiction of Native Americans that was presented in the animated film from 53. And just a quick aside here. This, ironically enough, came about because of WDI's incredible attention to detail with the new Fantasyland version of Peter Pan Flight in Anaheim, as well as the Tokyo Disneyland version of the Dark Ride. The Imagineers wanted, as accurately as possible, to recreate the specific look of Disney's hand-drawn version of J.M. Barrie's story, which is why Tiger Lily and her dad, the Indian chief, looked as closely as possible to the characters from the 53 film, which, as time went by, wasn't really seen as a virtue. Native American families would climb aboard the Peter Pan flight and then look down as their pirate ship flew over Neverland Island, look down at that Indian encampment and see, well, to be blunt, a hurtful stereotype. Now, to give the Disney company credit, over time, they recognized that Tiger Lily, her dad, the Indian chief, not to mention the other Redmen who made up the Pickaninny tribe, they recognized they were becoming problematic, which is why after Disneyland Paris's version of Peter Pan Flight opened in April of 1992, the Imagineers began playing down this specific aspect of the 1953 film whenever they made a new dark ride based on Disney's Peter Pan. Now, Hong Kong Disneyland, which opened in September of 2005, it doesn't have a Peter Pan Flight at all, whereas Shanghai Disneyland's version of Peter Pan Flight, which opened with the rest of that resort in June of 2016, with the exception of a handful of teepees that circle a campfire that guests can view as they fly over Neverland Island, doesn't include Tiger Lily or her dad, the Indian chief, at all. Also, rather than pretending that the Tiger Lily character never existed, Walt Disney Studios went another way with their 2023 film for Disney Plus of Peter Pan and Wendy. And this was written by David Lowery, I want to say, and written and directed, by the way. And he deliberately cast Alyssa Wampanoag Stock, who is a member of the Big Stone Cree First Nation up in Canada, to play Tiger Lily. And in Peter Pan and Wendy, Alyssa, when she's playing Tiger Lily, speaks both English as well as the Cree language. More to the point that the outfit that Wampataka wears is inspired by archival images of authentic Cree culture. The outfit she wears has this amazing, elaborate, handmade beadwork. Well worth checking out. Which now brings us back to what just happened to the Peter Pan flight at Florida's Magic Kingdom. This Fantasyland dark ride, as I mentioned earlier in the show, closed just 6 weeks ago for what was originally billed as an unremarkable rehab. But when Peter Pan flight reopened officially on August 16th, as guests flew over Neverland Island, they noticed something new down in that Indian encampment. And instead of Tiger Lily, her dad, the Indian chief, and those stereotypical red men from Disney's 1953 film, what people now saw was a much more respectful and accurate portrayal of North American culture. This scene in Peter Pan flight now showed Tiger Lily and her grandmother gracefully performing the traditional fancy shawl butterfly dance around that campfire, which, by the way, is a traditional dance that the Cherokee people perform at their annual powwows. And just so you know, the Imagineers have indicated that in the not-so-distant future, the version of Peter Pan flight that guests experience when they visit the original Disneyland out in California will receive a similar makeover of its Indian encampment scene. What people see is that their pirate ship flies over Neverland Island. Now, mind you, with every step forward, there is often a step back, and while people are applauding what Disney has done with the Indian encampment scene at Peter Pan flight in Florida, it's worth noting that the Peter Pan Neverland Adventure attraction, which just opened at Tokyo Disney Seas back on June 6th of this year, 2024, as part of that theme park's Fantasy Springs expansion, it has a scene that directly references the What Made a Red Man Red musical number from Disney's animated Peter Pan from 1953. Which makes me wonder, is that eventually going to get addressed? Likewise, the version of the Indian encampment scene at Tokyo Disney and Disneyland Paris, the one you find in those parks' version of Peter Pan flight, which still feature Tiger Lily and her dad, the Indian chief, along with those stereotypical red men from Disney 53 film. Look, I trust that the Imagineers will eventually get around to dealing with this issue with the other Disney theme parks, which, given that the mantra that we all know from Disney's Peter Pan, that all it takes is faith, trust, and a little bit of pixie dust, I guess that's as good a place as any to end today's feature piece. And speaking of which, that's going to do it for today's show. You can help support Mr. Testa and my efforts by subscribing over at patreon.com/Jim Hill Media, which is where we're posting exclusive shows every week, and which is where, later this week, veteran Imagineer Jim Schul and I will be discussing the changes that were just made to the Storybook Land Canal Boat ride at Disneyland Paris, which, by the way, is slated to reopen to the public later this week on Schmurz Day, August 30th. And again, just a reminder, Mr. Testa, Len will be returning for next week's edition of Disney Dish, probably sporting a gorgeous tan. And speaking of getting tan, this podcast is produced spectacularly by Eric Hersey and David Gray, who undoubtedly will be catching some rays as they lead next Saturday's Yoga on the Beach seminar at Hampton Beach, which is located along the shores of the Atlantic in my home state of New Hampshire. Just a reminder, guys, make sure that everyone puts on lots of sunscreen before you get around to having them do downward facing dog. That's the part of this yoga seminar where a lot of people will be pointing body parts toward the sky that don't normally get a lot of sun. And let's be honest here, nobody wants to head into the long Labor Day weekend with second-degree burns on that part of their anatomy, if you know what I mean. Anyway, while Eric and David are doing that, please go over to iTunes and rate and recommend our show, and more to the point, tell us what you want to hear next. Anyway, for Len, this is Jim, and we will see you on our next show.